Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Surya Prakash Upadhyay from Indian Institute of Technology, Mandi. Today we are going to discuss about module Industrial Company Towns and Planned State Capitals under the paper of Sociology of Urban Transformations. The objective of this module is to help you see the complex processes of urban planning in India in a historical perspective. So, case studies of planned industrial towns and state capitals are presented to highlight the tensions between planned urbanization and the unplanned or informal sector that emerges around these planned cores. So, this module aims to facilitate you to gain a historical perspective on the processes of planned urbanization in India. Because urbanization is not simply a one-time product. It is also a process. So to understand this intersections of physical planning with their sociological impacts is one of the major aims of this module. Towards the end, we will be looking at some of the similarities and differences in the experiences of the cases that we present to you. If you look at the history of India, so the history of planned settlements in Indian subcontinents, it goes back to the Indus Valley civilization. So historians and archaeologists have pointed out certain aspects such as brick sizes in cities and that cities that were far apart from each other, as well as the well-planned drainage and sanitation system and a well-laid out system of streets were some of the features of the planning that we have seen in Indian subcontinent. In the recent past, we also see planning examples in some of the temple towns like Madurai, or the imperial city of Fatehpur Sikri, or the grid city of Jaipur. So one can also add to this numerous planned settlements such as the railway colonies, military cantonments, and the university towns, and that are planned for certain class of people. But all these were planned, and they varied in scale also, and they just from a few neighborhoods to elaborately planned townships. So in this essay, we will look at two kinds of planned cities. One, those established as steel towns, or the ones built as and the other ones, those who are built as state capitals. So however, as urban transformation takes place, classifications are always evolving. So what characterizes planned cities? Scholars have pointed to several criteria that delineate a planned city as opposed to an organic settlement. The cases that we pick up in this paper were all planned on greenfield sites, that is, were built as new towns separated significantly from any previously existing town and were built from scratch. With regard to industrialization of India, industrialization significantly changed the nature of urbanization the world over. While on the one hand, industrial activity brings along with it issues of migration, pollution, working and living conditions, etc. On the other hand, these towns are often at the forefront of developments in urban infrastructure such as electricity and public transport. What can be a better reflection of these changes than to look at the industrial towns themselves, especially those that have been planned as such? Apart from providing a historical perspective of each of the three towns, that is Jamshedpur, Raulkela and Bhilai, in this module we will address certain key themes also. First, the role these towns played in the national imagination, and then moving on to the conflicts and contradictions that emerge as a result of migration, labor issues, economic cycles, and the diversity of communities that come to inhabit these towns. Jamshedpur is situated in the state of Jharkhand, about 290 km west of Kolkata. Now more than 100 years old, Jamshedpur was the first steel city of India built during British rule by the Indian pioneer Jamshedji Tata. As the legend goes, Jamshedji Tata traveled to Pittsburgh in North America in his quest to find technical expertise to set up India's first steel plant. There he requested a geologist to help him identify a site in India. It took 3 years to narrow down a small tribal village called Sakshi on the Chota Nagpur plateau. The site is surrounded by Dalma Hills, and the rivers Subarnarekha and Karkai form the northern and western edges. Unlike New Delhi or Chandigarh, that were designed in one grand gesture by well-known architects, Jamshedpur was incrementally planned by several engineers and architects over a period of 34 years. In 1800, industrial towns in England and elsewhere were encountering a range of problems. A large influx of laboring population needed to be housed, and the infrastructure for their settlements was far from adequate. Jamshedji Tata wrote to his son Dorabji in 1902 a legendary letter: "Be sure to leave wide streets planted with shady trees, every other of a quick growing variety. Be sure that there is plenty of place for lawns and gardens. Reserve large areas for football, hockey and parks. Earmark areas for Hindu temples, Mohammedan mosques and Christian churches." This note reflects a modern and secular sensibility which also extended to industrial policies for urban workforce. Julian Kennedy and Axel Schalin from Pittsburgh firm were hired to build a colony for workers. This initial colony was only for managers and skilled workers. The typical American gridiron layout was adopted for this settlement that was set atop a ridge. However, the need for housing for the laborers was ignored, and very soon clusters of temporary housing camps came up around the factory gates. In the second round of expansion, Frederick Charles Temple, a sanitary engineer, was hired to plan the growth in the township. Given his expertise as a sanitary engineer and his familiarity with tribal populations, Temple sought to design with ecological and social sensitivity. The Temple plan utilized already existing paths that followed the natural contours to build an inner circle, which he then connected to the already existing settlements. By the 1930s, Tata Steel was the largest producer of steel in the British Empire. The population of Jamshedpur in this period had increased from a mere 10,000 in 1910 to upwards of 80,000 in 1930. This time, a military engineer was entrusted with the task of building housing for the ever-expanding population of the worker. Stokes' plan was to house the laborers as close to the factory as possible, as they could not afford the cost of transportation. The fourth wave of expansion in Jamshedpur came with the increased need for steel during the World War II, leading to a tremendous surge in population. J.R.D. Tata, the then chairman of Tata Company, described Königsberg's plan in the following words: "It will ensure the harmonious development of Jamshedpur in a manner which will satisfy the manifold needs, functional and aesthetic, of this beautiful garden city." Although influenced by Ebenezer Howard's Garden City movement, Königsberger was limited in his ability to implement it in the Jamshedpur plan owing to the already existing industry and housing. His recommendation was to build 12,000 units of prefabricated housing every year using Tata Steel and precast blocks. This too, however, did not solve the problem of exponential growth and influx of laborers. The working populations in Jamshedpur came from all parts of India and the world. Jamshedpur was known for its progressive and cosmopolitan environment. The workers' need of housing, children's education, recreation and sports, etc. were taken care of by the company. Studies conducted in the 1960s observed the contradictions between modernity and tradition that characterized the life of Jamshedpur residents. The housing arrangement that placed people of similar economic backgrounds next to each other were predicated to erase caste and region-based affiliation, but this was not necessarily the ground reality. A study by Michael Ames discusses the various ways in which caste, religion, and regional affiliations manifested in the company town. Most workers had strong connections with their rural roots and followed to some extent what the author calls class for the city and caste for the village. However, caste was still evident when it came to marriage, dining, and certain occupations such as sweeper and mochi. Amis also argued against the belief that the Indian joint family system will die out in industrial modernized towns, showing that the joint family system itself is flexible and has helped the modern young family adapt to the pressures of industrialization. Today, Tata Steel remains the largest employer in Jamshedpur, but several new industries have developed, many of these catering to the needs of the Tata Steel factory and town. Some of the tribal villages that surrounded the town initially transformed into shanty towns or bastis and subsequently were planned as worker housing colonies. Unplanned bastis in the periphery continue and constitute the 35% of Jamshedpur that does not have access to the basic services of clean drinking water and sewage. Disparity in the distribution of basic services in the ever-expanding town is one of the major problems with Jamshedpur. Recent developments in development programs in Jamshedpur seek to rework the density of the residential fabric, thereby housing a large number of people within the planned areas. Jamshedpur is unique also in its governance and service provision. It began as a privately owned town and till today it does not have a municipal corporation. Instead, Tata Steel provides all municipal services such as water and electricity to those residing in the town. So we have discussed about Jamshedpur, and now when we talk about Bhilai, which is located in the Durg district of Chhattisgarh, it was a small village until the late 1950s. In 1959, the government of India and the erstwhile Union of Socialist Republic, that is USSR, signed an agreement to establish an integrated iron and steel plant in Bhilai. Bhilai was chosen due to its location and the availability of natural resources in close proximity. The Bhilai steel plant is a public sector undertaking that functions as a unit of Steel Authority of India Limited, that is SAIL. The Bhilai steel plant, that is BSP, symbolizes the Nehruvian vision of modernity and technological advancement for India. Nehru spoke of BSP as symbol and portent of the India of the future. The BSP today is the largest steel plant in India and covers nearly 17 square kilometers. Adjacent to the plant is the plant town of Bhilai that is laid out in sectors. Each sector is a mix of residential houses, shopping centers, schools and playgrounds. The houses for managers consist of bungalows, complete with a lawn and veranda, while the workers' housing consists mainly of barracks. This planned part of the town is surrounded by unregulated urban sprawl in the form of bastis. Apart from developing the Indian steel industry, one of the primary planning priorities of the time was generation of employment. It was by design then that the location for the plant was chosen in a backward rural area. However, it has been documented in the initial phase, the villagers from the surrounding villages were hesitant to join the factory. The reasons cited range from the limited needs of the rural population that did not compel them to take on additional work, and also certain superstitions prevalent in the area regarding the plant. However, there are several interviews that are available about Bhilai. One such is by Paris with the BSP workers that reveal that these categories might be more fluid and that many of the workers he interviewed had initially come as the construction workers and were now assigned to other jobs. Perry also notes that while Tamil and Telugu migrants came in mixed sex groups, often accompanied by families, the North Indian migrants usually came as individuals and only called in their families later. In Perry's words, Bhilai embodied the Nehruvian national imagination of a modern secular India, and in that sense, as much about forging society as about forging steel. Now, to what extent does this secular and modern attitude translate into social relations in today's Bhilai? Scholars have observed that compared to many other towns in India, Bhilai has been able to maintain somewhat benign ethnic relations, except for an incident of anti-Muslim violence in 1964. The spatial distribution of its ethnic and religious population is comparatively more heterogeneous, and even urban ghettos originally set up by Malayalis or Maharashtrian have over the years acquired mixed population. Some part of the unique Bhilai work and life ethics is attributed to the Russian influence. When compared to Raulkela, also a public street town, which we are going to discuss in the next slide, which was set up with the help of the Germans, the Bhilai steel plant has performed much more better. The Russian work ethic instilled a culture of egalitarianism and austerity in both the Russian and Indian managers of the town, while at the same time managing dissent by encouraging only the management-friendly trade union to operate. Knowledge was freely shared and the Indian workforce was trained to take over the plant from the Russians. The success of the project, it has been argued, played a significant role in the people's willingness to buy into the Nehruvian project and accept the melting pot. So as we discussed about Bhilai, we saw that it was set up by the Russians, with the help of the Russians. Raulkela came into being with the collaboration of the Germans, and Raulkela is an industrial town in the northwestern Orissa that, like Bhilai, was set up around a public sector steel plant as part of India's second five-year plan. Raurkela was the first of these public sector steel townships and seen as one of the temples of modern India. At that time, Raurkela was a small settlement adjacent to a rail line along the Calcutta-Mumbai route. The present population of Raurkela is around 5 lakhs. The Raurkela plant was, as I said, the Raurkela plant was set up with German technical assistance. Since employment generation was a key objective, all of these towns were set up in rural areas, encouraging the local people to transition from peasantry to proletarians and facilitating an influx of migrants from all over the country. The hopes of the country were pinned on industry-led urbanization to propel India into the modern world. However, very soon, in about 15 years of their establishment, this exemplary national dream word came to be viewed as exemplary national catastrophe. So what happened? What went wrong? Several scholars have shown that ethnic tensions and caste antagonisms heightened in these steel towns, particularly Raurkela. In Raurkela, tensions between Hindustan Steel and the government of Orissa existed right at the outset, basically related to the composition of the workforce. Punjabis and Bengalis, many of whom were partition refugees, made up a large percentage of the higher grade, and clerks were mainly Malayalis. In terms of local employment, an inquiry done in 1959 by State Government Commission found that only 12% of the Class 1 and 2 employees, while 33% of Class 3 and 61% of Class 4 employees were from Orissa. In 1964, anti-Muslim riot broke out in Raurkela. Refugees from East Pakistan were routinely packed into a special train in Calcutta and taken to resettlement sites in Madhya Pradesh. Jamshedpur and Raulkela were two of the stops midway where the refugees were given their meals. On one such transit stop, the local Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, that is RSS, and Jan Sangh activists used loudspeakers to spread anti-Muslim sentiments and therefore violence erupted. It spread from the railway station into the nearby bastis, and soon the whole town was up in arms against the Muslim minority. Over 700 Muslim families initially moved into this newly constructed block, which paved the way for ethnic ghettoization. A similar ghettoization happened for the Sikh population after the 1984 anti-Sikh riots in Raulkela. Tensions persist between Oriyas and the Adivasis as between the Oriyas and the Bengalis. Moreover, there was a shift in the demographies of the workforce at Raulkela steel plant that further fueled antagonisms amongst the multi-ethnic residents in Raulkela. The first shift happened when in 1969 the Union Ministry of Labour mandatory for all jobs with salaries less than Rs 500 per month be filled with applications registered at the local employment agency. This dislodged the seniority and expectations of many who had been working on contract with the plant with the hope of getting regularized. Then in 1989, a new regulation was made in which registration in the employment exchange opened to only those who had a certificate of residence in Orissa. By then, a whole generation of outsider children had grown up in Raulkela and considered the city their home, but were considered ineligible for employment and registration. The result was a large-scale Oriaization of the workforce. So in today's Raulkela, the mineral-rich landscape of western Orissa has attracted many more industrialists, government projects and multinational corporations. A large number of the tribal population have been dispossessed. This is evident in the dramatic reduction in regular workforce at the RSP. The workforce in RSP, that is Raulkela steel plant, in the 1990s was of 36,000 people, but by 2009 it has been reduced to only 19,500 people. One sees in these company towns a certain aristocracy of labor, of those employed in the regular public sector. However, the formalization of trade union politics and the alienation of these workers from the employed on contractual or informal basis led to a fragmentation of the working class. One sees therefore that despite the reduction in number of employees in the steel plant, there has not been a single protest on this issue. In the neoliberal environment of Raulkela today, the government's aspiration has been to attract as much foreign capital into the state without regard to actual local labor needs or natural resources. Therefore, Orissa today stands as one of the prime destinations within India. So having said that, if you look at the planning criteria or the planning ideas, it reflected the political economic aspirations of a newly emerging nation. Each one of the cases that we are going to take up in this module will investigate, and because they were set up with high ideals, with the hope that they will usher in an era of modernity in India. It has also been pointed out that the principles behind planned towns in India and perhaps everywhere have emerged through a halting pattern rather than a conscious evolutionary process, and are often not in tune with the Indian conditions. Moreover, these towns that we're going to talk about, although planned, have emerged as urban areas with a planned core around which unplanned growth has accrued. The difference between the planned and organic parts of a town is particularly evident in the uneven distribution of the basic amenities such as electricity, water supply and sewerage. Shivaramakrishnan argues that the planned industrial towns are often seen as employed towns rather than as citizen towns, especially as a confusion lies in the role of the center as manager of the industrial plant versus government for the people. So on the other hand, the new planned state capitals such as Chandigarh, Bhubaneswar, Gandhinagar, they were imagined and attempted the construction of certain kinds of citizens for the new nation state. In the following section that we are going to discuss, we will attempt to see how all of these imaginations played out in the way these planned towns have evolved. We will delve into the history, planning principles, and emerging sociological concerns in these cities. So let us start with the industrial towns, specifically steel towns in India. So for Chandigarh, Nehru, outlining his vision for the new city in the early 1950s, said, "Let this be a new town, unfettered by the traditions of the past, an expression of the country's faith in the future." So Chandigarh was planned as a new capital city for Punjab, since Lahore was in Pakistan. It was meant to resettle the displaced populations, bring some hope and stability to a region that had undergone the trauma of partition, and most importantly, to serve as the symbol of new, modern, and independent India. Chandigarh, which is located about 250 kilometers north of Delhi, and this location was chosen because of its distance from the border as opposed to Amritsar, and it has a relatively flat terrain also. Also, the cost of acquisition of land there was much lesser than alternatives such as Ambala or Ludhiana. Further, in Nehru's words, the site was free from the existing encumbrances of the old town and old traditions. For the first phase of Chandigarh, 8,500 acres of fertile land consisting of 17 villages were acquired in one go, and that too under the Land Acquisition Act of 1894. So plots were sold to the general public with the first preference reserved for displaced groups and individuals who came from Pakistan. In order to fulfill this dream of setting up a new town that would resolve social and economic problems of the nation, Albert Mayer, an American architect who had several years of prior experience in India, was hired. Mayer, along with his associate Matthew Nowicki, came up with a fan-hacked plan spanning the land between two rivulets, Pateli Ki Rao and Sugna Chau. He divided the city into super blocks, and in his planning was searching for an idiom that was modern and Indian at the same time. However, Nowicki died in a plane crash soon after, and a new team led by Le Corbusier was ushered in to take on this grand project of town planning. Corbusier was to be assisted by two architects, Jane Drew and Maxwell Fry. The idea was that in this process, several Indian architects would be trained, who would then go on to plan and develop at least 300 new towns in India. Corbusier's and Nehru's modern sensibilities meshed well, and Corbusier had a free hand in dictating the Chandigarh plan. He took the super block from Mayer's plan and converted these into sectors that were self-sufficient neighborhood units, and each sector had its own marketplace, schools, and religious institutions. In Sector 1, the head of the city, Corbusier placed the major government offices, that is the Secretariat, the High Court, and the Assembly building. An artificial lake was also created. To one side of this grid plan was placed the university and a medical research hospital, whereas on the other side was the industrial area. The city was to be surrounded on a radius of 5 km on all sides by forested land. An existing rivulet running through the city was framed on both sides by green spaces and called the Leisure Valley. The sectors, or the containers of family life, as Corbusier envisaged them, were segregated on the basis of social class. Traffic circulation too was segregated into a hierarchy of roads ranging from V1S to V7S, whereas V1S would be the high-speed roads with mixed traffic, and the V7S were designed as a bicycle paths. The capital complex towards the north dominated the plan by its sheer monumentality and symbolism woven into its architectural gesture. Notable among the structures at the Capitol complex is the open hand monument. So this is a graphic representation of an open palm that is placed on top of a tall column and pivoted in a manner so as to move with the wind. The open hand is placed within an area, within an open theater called the trench of consideration. The two symbolic ideas in this structure reveal the social and political dreams of the architect. The trench of consideration was envisaged as a place where the citizens of the city collect and deliberate upon the matters of the state. Open hand itself proclaimed the idea that a city was open to giving and receiving ideas. That the open hand monument today is closed to public gatherings, and the plaza surrounding the trench of consideration is used as a heavily guarded parking for high court judges. This speaks the volumes to the huge gap between planning intention and the real urban politics. In 1996, Punjab was further partitioned into Punjab and Haryana, and based on religious and linguistic differences. Chandigarh today is the capital for both Punjab and Haryana. And apart from being a union territory itself, it therefore houses the government offices for Punjab, Haryana and the central government. There are two high courts and two assemblies. Both Punjab and Haryana have constructed satellite towns flanking Chandigarh on two sides, that is Mohali and Panchkula respectively. These towns too follow the same grid planning and sectors as planned neighborhood units. For several decades after its inception, the primary population of Chandigarh consisted of government officials and the families. The neighborhoods and sectors were planned based on government ranking, and hierarchy was clearly woven into the planning. Much as the city promised a socialist ideal, the inequality was woven into the design itself. Moreover, Sarin in her study on Chandigarh shows how the planning process does not take into account the informal sector. The informal sector or the informal economy is treated as an enforcement problem rather than as an intrinsic part of the city. Post 1990, with the advent of a more neoliberal era, many things have changed, and as we have been discussing in other modules as well. The government acquired large tracts of land from areas surrounding Chandigarh and sold it to high-end real estate developers and the IT industry. Subsequently, land use in the industrial area changed such that it is pretty much an agglomeration of malls, hotels, automobile showrooms and cinema halls. This transformation in the urban landscape are demonstrative of the shifts in the Indian economy from a manufacturing centered one to a more service centered one. One can see the signs of affluence in the high consumption patterns of the residents of Chandigarh. So city also has the highest per capita car ownership in this country. The poor populations in the city are carefully concealed in the peripheral areas. Their contribution to the labor of building the city remain simply unacknowledged. In 1966, Punjab was further partitioned into Punjab and Haryana based on religious and linguistic differences. Chandigarh today is the capital for both Punjab and Haryana, apart from being a union territory itself. It therefore houses the government offices for Punjab, Haryana and the central government. There are two high courts and two assemblies. Both Punjab and Haryana have constructed satellite towns flanking Chandigarh on two sides, that is Mohali and Panchkula respectively. These towns too follow the same grid planning and sectors as planned neighborhoods units. For several decades after its inception, the primary population of Chandigarh consisted of government officials and their families. The neighborhoods and sectors were planned based on government ranking, and hierarchy was clearly woven into the planning. Much of the city promised a socialist ideal. The inequality was woven into the design itself. Moreover, Sarin in 1979 in her study on Chandigarh shows how the planning process does not take into account the informal sector. The informal economy is treated as an enforcement problem rather than an intrinsic part of the city. Post 1991, with the advent of neoliberal era, many things have changed. The government acquired large tracts of land from areas surrounding Chandigarh and sold it to high-end real estate developers and the IT industry. Subsequently, land use in the industrial area changed such that it is pretty much an agglomeration of malls, hotels, automobile showrooms, and cinema halls. These transformations in the urban landscape are demonstrative of the shifts in Indian economy from a manufacturing-centered one to a more service-centered one. One can see signs of affluence in the high consumption patterns of the residents of Chandigarh. The city also has the higher per capita car ownership in the country. The poor populations in the city are carefully concealed in the peripheral areas. Their contribution into the labor of building the city remain unacknowledged. While Chandigarh was being planned as the new capital of Punjab in North India, Bhubaneswar was being planned as a modern capital of the state of Orissa. The planning of the new town was done by a German Jew architect, Otto Königsberg, who had been working in India since 1930s. Influenced by the Garden City movement and also aware of the realities of Indian social life, Königsberg planned a modern town complete with wide roads and parks. However, today's Bhubaneswar has far exceeded the planned boundaries, and just like most other Indian towns, a mix of planned and unregulated growth characterizes the contemporary city. Chandigarh and Bhubaneswar, both state capitals, were planned by Western architects, but by the 1960s, when Gandhinagar was to build, the country had enough trained expertise in both architecture and engineering. Gandhinagar was built as the capital of Gujarat after the Bombay Presidency was partitioned in 1960. Located on the banks of the river Sabarmati, not too far from Ahmedabad on fertile plains, the new capital had to live up to the legacy of Corbusier's Chandigarh. Local business elite in Gujarat therefore invited the American architect Louis Kahn. However, the political pressure to make Gandhinagar an indigenously planned town and a legacy of Gandhi's ideals was too strong, and eventually two Indian architects who had apprenticed with Le Corbusier were chosen, and they were H.K. Mewada and Prakash Apte. Like Chandigarh, Gandhinagar too has sectors, and street grid is oriented in a way so as to avoid the afternoon glare. Inspired by Chandigarh, sun, space, and green cover were elements that the architect sought to incorporate in Gandhinagar. The central capital complex was surrounded by 30 residential sectors that were just a little smaller than those in Chandigarh. The idea here was that no resident would need to cross a road in order to get to the basic needs of shopping, healthcare, and school. The use of the bicycle was to be encouraged. However, the way Chandigarh has developed tells of the influence of state bureaucracy and pressure from industrialists. Today, the pressure to develop and profit from real estate has taken over, and peripheral areas around the city are seeing aggressive development, especially on the 23-kilometer road leading to Ahmedabad. In fact, it has been argued that such haphazard development will stall the sustainable economic and social growth of Gandhinagar and make it nothing more than a suburb of Ahmedabad. So, students, let us summarize what we have learned in this module. It's quite unusual way of summarizing this, but I would rather request you to ask certain questions like, what is common to the experience of all the planned cities in India, including those discussed in this module? Why is it that all of these cities start out with grand utopian visions, but then collapse into the same chaotic conditions that plague unplanned urban growth. Can urban planning and design resolve societal problems? What is the relationship between an urban architect's or planner's conception and residents or users' conception of a city? Because looking at the experiences of diverse planned cities such as Jamshedpur and Chandigarh, we can perhaps arrive at commonalities and lessons that we have that help us understand urban transformation in contemporary India. In all of the cities presented in this module, we see that while a small part of the city was planned and designed with grand visionary gestures, the planners focused more on form and aesthetics. In this module, we also have discussed that cities created in the 20th century and were either industrial cities or state capitals. In both the cases, the agenda was to build a certain national space and citizenship. However, urbanization is changing in the 21st century, and we also see the shift from a more industrial to a consumer-based model. We also see some sort of changing in the nature of the state itself. There's a flexibility of law also, and this flexibility of law are often very rational processes that aid to territorial expansion and capital accumulation for a select class. So it is a time that we take a deeper look at the urban processes, planned or otherwise, in order to reclaim our cities as inclusive spaces. Thank you.